You'd think if someone wanted to get married in your backyard, they'd at least tell you. But not Karen. No, Karen decided my backyard was her venue, without asking, without paying, and without a single ounce of shame. I found out about the wedding when a man with a tape measure stepped over my koi pond and said, "We're thinking string lights from the fence to the oak tree." I blinked. "We?" He smiled and pointed to a clipboard. "Karen said this is where the vows are happening." That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with your average bridezilla, I was dealing with the HOA queen of delusion. Let me rewind just a bit. I moved into Maplewood Hills a year ago, lured in by the peace and quiet, the tall trees, and the kind of neighborhood where you wave at each other without having to talk. I'm a software engineer by trade, a backyard gardener by passion. I spent months turning my lawn into a mini paradise, native wildflowers, a bubbling pond, string lights I hung myself, and a set of handmade cedar benches under the shade of a 200-year-old oak. I called it my no-drama zone. But then Karen happened. Karen is the HOA president, a woman who wears blazers with shoulder pads and wields her clipboard like a medieval sword. She once fined me $25 for leaving my trash bin out for longer than acceptable visibility. I asked her to define acceptable visibility. She handed me a 5-page document with highlighted sections and sticky note. That's the kind of woman she is. Everyone in the neighborhood fears her, but I've never been good at fearing people who confuse power with personality. I smiled, paid the fine in quarters, and moved on. So when I came home one Wednesday afternoon to find 3 people in my backyard, one of them literally sketching on a blueprint labeled wedding layout, I figured there had been a mistake. I asked them who they were. They introduced themselves as the wedding planner, the florist, and the audio technician. Apparently, the DJ was stuck in traffic. I didn't even get to finish asking, "Whose wedding?" before the florist interrupted with, "Karen's daughter. She said you were happy to help." I don't think I've ever laughed and choked on my own spit at the same time before. Of course, Karen didn't pick up when I called, or texted, or knocked on her door. I finally got a reply 2 hours later. "Don't be difficult, Max. The community appreciates your support. You'll love being part of something beautiful." I stared at that message like it was written in ancient Greek. What community? Who agreed to this? Did I miss a newsletter with the headline, "Your yard is now a free venue"? I sent her one word. "No," she replied with a thumbs-up emoji. A thumbs up. I could feel my blood pressure trying to escape through my ears. The next day, I came outside to find a box labeled "Tent Anchors" on my back patio. 2 men were unloading poles and pegs into the corner near my prized irises. I told them they had the wrong address. They showed me a printed diagram that had my name, my lot number, and even a label that said "Ceremony Area, Do Not Disturb Wildlife." I almost lost it. That night, I started looking through the HOA rules, trying to find out what kind of legal gymnastics Karen was attempting. That's when I discovered the most infuriating clause I've ever read. Temporary community events on private property may be allowed with assumed consent if they serve a greater neighborhood interest and do not require structural alteration. Assumed consent. The word stared at me like a taunt. Karen had found the legal equivalent of a loophole trampoline and was bouncing on it in heels. Now, here's where things get interesting. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. But I am thorough. And I don't like being treated like a doormat with good grass. I looked up the weather forecast. Rain. Not a sprinkle, full-blown thunderclouds. And I knew something Karen didn't. My yard has terrible drainage in the back corner. It's a project I planned to fix next spring. But if she insisted on setting up tents there, well, let's just say I didn't feel motivated to correct her. I also have a smart irrigation system. And let's just say I felt very motivated to test the settings. Still, I gave her one last chance. I sent her a message. "Forecast shows rain this weekend. Might want to rethink the setup." She replied with, "It's handled. Don't interfere." That was the moment I knew this was going to end spectacularly. The next morning, her daughter showed up. She didn't even knock, just wandered into my backyard with a measuring tape and a folder. When I confronted her, she said, "Oh, I thought this was the public event space Karen told us about." I almost clapped. Public event space. My koi pond's little waterfall gurgled like it was laughing with me. It wasn't long before the neighborhood chatter started. I overheard someone at the grocery store saying, "Did you hear Karen got Max to host the wedding?" Another neighbor said, "I thought he offered. She said he's the one who suggested it." I couldn't decide what was more impressive, Karen's ability to lie or her confidence that no one would challenge it. But I was about to do both. I walked out into my yard that evening and stared at the oak tree. That's where they planned to say their vows. I thought about the roots under the soil, how easily water pooled there when it rained, how long it would take to dry. And then I looked at my sprinkler system. I made a few adjustments. Nothing illegal. Just a thorough test run that coincidentally coincided with the rain forecast. By now, the tents were half assembled. The chairs had arrived. There was a trailer marked "Catering, Do Not Tilt." Karen hadn't spoken to me directly in 3 days, but I saw her in the cul-de-sac, bragging to someone about the rustic aesthetic and natural lighting. I could barely contain my grin. She thought she was about to throw the wedding of the year. What she didn't know was that nature, and a slightly irritated tech nerd, had other plans. The madness didn't slow down. In fact, it escalated like a soap opera on fast forward. By the next morning, a large white truck labeled Events 360 pulled up in front of my house. 5 men jumped out like they were defusing a bomb, except the bomb was apparently Karen's fragile ego, and the mission was setting up a wedding she still hadn't gotten permission for. One of them walked up my driveway, nodded at me like we were old buddies, and asked, "We good to start anchoring the main tent?" I blinked at him, half expecting this to be some elaborate prank. But no, he had blueprints, permits, though none with my signature, and an order form with Karen Middleton, HOA coordinator, printed in bold font. I asked the guy one simple question. "Did you speak to the property owner?" He looked confused. "I thought that was you?" I told him I was, and then he paled a little and said, "Oh." Karen said it was all cleared. Cleared. Like my land was a crime scene she had authority to tape off. I told them to pause everything, and the lead guy seemed too polite to argue. But not 5 minutes later, Karen marched onto my lawn like she was the general of a poorly organized army. Clipboard in hand, heels digging into my turf, wearing a sun hat so large it could double as a parachute. She didn't even say hello. She launched straight into lecture mode. "Max, it's really disappointing to see you trying to sabotage such a beautiful moment. This is for the community. For love. Your resistance is making things very unpleasant." I stared at her for a solid 3 seconds before replying. "Karen, if you wanted to get married in my yard, you could have started by knocking on my front door instead of treating my lawn like a community park." She waved that off like I had offered a mildly inconvenient weather update. "Let's not get caught up in petty details. The permits are filed, the vendors are hired, and the guests are invited. We're moving forward." I asked her if she had a permit from the city to host an event of this size. She smiled like a kindergarten teacher dealing with a child who didn't understand how the alphabet worked. "Max, HOA events don't need city permit. We have our own guidelines." That's when I realized she truly believed the HOA existed in some sort of sovereign nation where municipal laws bent to her will. I wasn't going to argue logic with someone who used a clipboard as a personality. I simply said, "If anything damages my property, I will hold you personally and legally accountable." She scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." Dramatic? I wasn't the one planning a full-scale wedding on someone else's land like I was conquering a village. Within hours, things got more absurd. A generator was rolled in and parked right next to my tool shed. Folding tables were stacked near my flower beds. Someone started installing speakers. Big ones, the kind you'd use at a music festival. I caught a glimpse of the wedding schedule printed in fancy script. 2 p.m. ceremony under the oak tree, 3 p.m. champagne toast by the pond, 4 p.m. string quartet and hors d'oeuvre. They even labeled a section as Photo Corner, Rustic Charm, and marked it in front of my rose bushes. My name was nowhere on any of it. I was being erased in real time from my own backyard. Then came the letter. Slipped under my door like a mob warning. It was from the HOA board. Or rather, a single page printed with the HOA letterhead and signed by Karen, naturally. It said I was in breach of neighborhood harmony, and that any efforts to undermine an approved communal celebration could result in financial penalties. I nearly laughed out loud. Not only was she hijacking my yard, but she was threatening to fine me for not being happy about it. That letter was so ridiculous I actually framed it. It now sits in my home office under a plaque that says, Certified Madness. Still, I wasn't going to just let her run wild. That night, I did a little digging. Public records, city ordinances, even event regulations for gatherings over 25 people. Turns out, hosting a wedding on residential property, especially with amplified sound, hired staff, and portable toilets, requires a permit, a noise variance, and in some cases, even fire department approval. None of which Karen had. I checked. Twice. Now armed with actual leverage, I could have called the city and shut the whole thing down right away. But I didn't. Because by then, the weather forecast had shifted again. 80% chance of rain on the big day. That was the moment the idea crystallized. I wasn't going to stop the wedding. I was going to let it happen exactly the way Karen planned it, on soggy, unpermitted, legally questionable ground. As a backup move, I also began documenting everything. Photos, videos, screenshots of text. A full digital folder titled, Operation Karen Storm. Just in case she tried to spin things later, and knowing Karen, she absolutely would. Over the next few days, the chaos grew louder. Karen barked orders like she was directing a military parade. She even installed a temporary no trespassing sign at the edge of my own yard to prevent unwanted interruption during her daughter's wedding rehearsal. I walked up to her while she was sticking it into the soil and said, "Karen, you do know this is my property line, right?" Without even turning, she said, "Temporary boundaries, Max, try to see the bigger picture." The caterers arrived that afternoon. 4 of them, hauling trays of shrimp and something in glass jars that smelled expensive. When I asked if they had a food handling permit for the event, they said, Karen said everything was cleared. Of course she did. That evening, I noticed Karen standing in the middle of my yard holding her phone up, trying to capture the sunset. I could hear her say to someone, "Just imagine, golden hour, violins, vows under the oak, and everyone we know watching. It's going to be perfect." And then she added, "And Max? He'll come around. He always does. These types can't resist being part of something bigger." That's when I realized something. Karen thought I was just one of her little HOA minions. She truly believed I would roll over and smile for the photo op. She didn't know that I had no intention of cooperating. In fact, I was making plans. Big ones. Subtle ones. Plans that involved my smart irrigation system, some unfortunate drainage patterns, and a whole lot of karma. She had no clue her dream wedding was about to turn into a mud wrestling match, with her at center stage. The morning before the wedding, the clouds rolled in like a slow, rumbling promise. The sky turned a bruised shade of gray, thick with the kind of humidity that clings to your skin and makes your hair do things it shouldn't. Birds were oddly quiet. My sprinkler system had just finished a routine maintenance cycle, which somehow happened to run a little longer than normal. The soil, already soft from the rising groundwater, was now bordering on marshland. I stood at the edge of my backyard sipping coffee and watching the early stages of disaster unfold. Karen, meanwhile, was busy directing a team of workers like she was producing a Broadway show. One guy was struggling to hammer in a stake for the main tent, which kept sliding out of the soggy ground like it was rejecting the entire idea. Karen didn't seem to notice or care. She just waved her arms and barked orders. Her clipboard had acquired 3 new tabs. The string quartet arrived just after noon. 4 musicians dressed in all black, clearly regretting every life decision that brought them here, stepped into the lawn and instantly began sinking. One of them lifted his cello and muttered, "We're gonna need stilts." I wanted to help them, I really did. But I was far too invested in watching nature and karma form the ultimate tag team. Karen ran over and tried to usher them toward the oak tree, which was now surrounded by a shallow pool of standing water. I heard her say, "Just stick to the perimeter, try not to get your shoes wet." The violinist gave her a look that could have boiled water. An hour later, the florist truck pulled in. Bright van, cheerful branding, buckets of roses and peonies loaded into carts that promptly sank into my lawn like they were being absorbed by the earth itself. One of the florists, a young woman with pink streaks in her hair, looked around and said, "Is this a swamp?" Karen clapped her hands and said, "It's rustic." Another cart tipped over and dumped $300 worth of hydrangeas into the mud. The florist didn't respond. She just grabbed her phone and started Googling cancellation policies. I wandered outside and was immediately met with Karen's glare, as if I were the one who had summoned the clouds. "Max," she snapped, "can you please do something about the mud?" I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you mean on my property? The one you've been using without permission for your unauthorized wedding?" She ignored the comment completely and pointed to the corner near the pond. "The chairs are supposed to go there, but it's too soft. Maybe you could throw down some plywood?" I laughed, slowly and thoroughly, then took a sip of my coffee. "I think it's best I don't interfere. Wouldn't want to be accused of sabotaging your vision." Her eye twitched. By late afternoon, the guests had started arriving. They came in heels, in dress shoes, in linen suit. One elderly woman with a walker took 2 steps into the backyard and immediately began sinking. A groomsman rushed over to help her, only to trip over an exposed sprinkler head and land in a patch of thick, sticky muck that used to be my wildflower garden. His pastel pink pants were instantly ruined. Karen saw it happen and screamed at him for not watching where he was going. I'm pretty sure he flipped her off when she turned her back. The tent was listing slightly to one side. The cake, an elaborate 5-tier monstrosity shaped like a swan, was being wheeled in on a cart that bounced every time it hit a pocket of soft ground. By the time they got it under the tent, the bottom tier had a noticeable crack. Karen looked at it like she was watching a child fall off a bicycle. She clenched her fists and muttered something that sounded like, "This is still going to be perfect." And then came the champagne tower. I don't know who thought stacking 60 delicate glasses on a folding table was a good idea, but they went ahead and did it anyway. Karen stood nearby with her phone out, ready to record a slow-motion pour. The second bottle popped, the ground shifted, and the entire table tilted just enough for the tower to collapse in a cascade of shattered glass and sticky liquid. A collective gasp filled the yard. Karen didn't move. She just stood there, her smile frozen, like her brain hadn't caught up with reality yet. The only sound was the soft hiss of champagne bubbling in the mud. Someone finally had the good sense to call the event coordinator. A frantic woman with a headset and a clipboard of her own arrived and began barking into a walkie-talkie. She turned to Karen and said, "We need to move the ceremony. The soil's not holding anything, and we've got guests in formal wear sinking past their ankles." Karen's reply? "We are not moving this wedding. I don't care if the earth opens up. This is happening right here, right now." It was at that exact moment that the first crack of thunder rolled through the sky. I didn't add any dramatic sound effects. That was pure, natural spite from the universe itself. The skies opened up like they had been waiting for their cue, and within seconds, the drizzle turned into a full-blown downpour. Tents sagged. Decorations flapped. Guests screamed and ran for cover, most of which didn't exist. The string quartet abandoned their instruments and fled toward the driveway. The cake was left completely exposed and promptly began melting into a sugary mess. Karen, soaked and furious, marched toward me through ankle-deep mud, each step sucking at her high heels. She reached me, drenched, her mascara streaming down like war paint, and screamed, "You did this! You planned this!" I raised my eyebrows and gestured to the sky. "I control the weather now?" She pointed a shaking finger at my smart irrigation system box near the house. "I saw you adjusting it. You made it worse." I shrugged. "Routine test. You said not to interfere, remember?" She was too furious to speak, just stood there trembling like a soda can about to burst. That's when the police showed up. 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb, lights flashing but sirens off. Apparently, someone, maybe a neighbor tired of the chaos, had reported a disturbance, unpermitted amplified sound, and trespassing. One officer walked into the backyard and took it all in. The broken champagne glasses, the ruined decorations, the guests wading through mud, and Karen dripping wet and screeching about sabotage. He turned to me and asked, "You the property owner?" I nodded. He looked at Karen. "Did you get permission to host this event here?" Karen opened her mouth, stuttered, then finally said, "It's a community function." The officer squinted. "That's not a yes." I handed him the USB drive I had prepared. It had everything: screenshots of her texts, pictures of the tent setup, soil readings, and weather forecasts. He took it, nodded, and asked Karen to step aside for a quick chat. She glared at me one last time before stomping away, heelless now, her feet squelching in the mud. And just like that, the wedding was over. The aftermath looked like a battlefield, if the battlefield had been fought with fondue skewers, floral centerpieces, and soggy programs printed in gold foil. By the time the rain slowed to a drizzle, the guests were gone. Most of them had fled the moment the thunder started, piling into cars, limos, or just walking barefoot down the street to escape the mud-caked madness. My backyard, once my pride and joy, was now a war zone of overturned chairs, smashed dessert trays, and one lonely speaker still sputtering out soft classical music from beneath a tarp. The only thing that hadn't been ruined was the oak tree, still standing tall like it was silently judging everyone who had dared use it as a wedding prop. Karen stood near the remains of the champagne tower, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her cheeks, one fake eyelash clinging to her eyebrow like it was holding on for dear life. Her daughter was nowhere to be seen. The groomsmen were gathered under a neighbor's carport, shaking their heads and muttering things like, "Unreal," and "should have eloped." The caterers had left a half-loaded buffet table and disappeared. The string quartet's van peeled away 15 minutes ago, leaving a soggy cello case behind that nobody wanted to claim. I stayed on my porch, dry, watching the collapse of Karen's empire from a comfortable distance. She hadn't looked at me since the police took her aside to explain, very calmly, that no matter what HOA position she held, she did not have the legal right to commandeer someone else's private property. They asked her a few basic questions, and when she gave them the now infamous phrase, "community event with assumed consent," one of the officers actually laughed. She was issued a written warning and told she could be cited for trespassing and unauthorized commercial use of residential land if she attempted to continue the event. She sputtered something about talking to her lawyer, but the officers had already moved on to getting statements from the neighbors. Later that evening, after most of the wedding debris had been abandoned like leftovers from a failed parade, Karen's carefully curated narrative began to unravel. People started talking. Turns out, not everyone in the neighborhood was thrilled with Karen's leadership. Her iron rule had built up quiet resentment, petty fines, endless inspections, and her habit of rewriting rules to suit herself. I didn't need to do much at all. The rain had washed away her credibility more effectively than I ever could. By morning, someone had already drafted a petition to hold an emergency HOA vote. It circulated through the neighborhood like wildfire. I had 3 people knock on my door asking to sign it before I'd even finished breakfast. Karen must have known it was coming because by midday she tried to rally her usual allies, the nosy couple down the street, the guy who complained about Halloween decorations, but even they seemed wary now. The incident had gone viral on a local forum. Someone had recorded the champagne collapse and posted it with the caption, "Karen's wedding melts faster than her sanity." It had thousands of views and was still climbing. Then came the lawsuit threat. It arrived in the form of a passive-aggressive email, written with so many legal buzzwords it sounded like a bad courtroom drama. Karen accused me of willful sabotage, negligent irrigation abuse, and emotional distress. She even claimed I had deliberately flooded the lawn to intentionally destroy what was meant to be a momentous celebration of love. She demanded reimbursement for damages to the wedding equipment, the floral arrangements, and her daughter's custom gown, which she claimed had been emotionally stained beyond repair. I didn't respond to her directly. I forwarded the email to my attorney, who happened to be a friend from college and someone who genuinely enjoys dismantling nonsense. He called me laughing so hard he could barely speak. "Max," he said, "she actually attached a receipt for emotional damages. She tried to bill you for trauma." He drafted a polite but firm reply outlining the facts. No written permission was granted, the event was illegal under city code, and any further communication should go through legal channels. I added a note at the bottom, "P.S. Your clipboard is still on my lawn. Come get it when you're ready to apologize." The next twist came the day after that. Karen's daughter, who had barely been seen since the wedding implosion, finally re-emerged. She showed up at my door looking exhausted, mascara-streaked, and holding a garbage bag full of soaked decorations. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, voice flat. "I didn't know she didn't ask you." I nodded and offered her a towel. She sat on the porch, looked out at the cratered lawn, and sighed. She said everything was arranged. I should have known better. Then she dropped the bombshell. "We're calling off the wedding." Apparently, the groom had had enough. Between Karen's controlling behavior, the complete disaster of the event, and the realization that he had signed up for a lifelong relationship with someone whose mother would bulldoze personal boundaries with a floral arch, he'd ended it. Packed up his things, drove off that night, and sent a text saying, "I love you, but I can't survive another event like that." Karen's daughter didn't seem surprised. Just tired. She thanked me again and left, heels in one hand, a bottle of ruined champagne in the other. Karen, of course, did not take it well. The next few days were oddly quiet. Her house went dark. No HOA updates. No clipboard patrols. No passive-aggressive notes about non-compliant window treatments. Rumors began swirling. Some said she was holed up writing complaints to the city. Others said she'd gone to stay with a sister out of town. But by the end of the week, the HOA petition had enough signatures. The vote was held in the community center with standing room only. Karen didn't show. Maybe she knew what was coming. The vote was swift and unanimous. She was removed from her position as HOA president, her rule officially over. People clapped. Someone popped a bottle of sparkling cider. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood felt like a community rather than a kingdom ruled by clipboard decree. And then came the cherry on top. 2 neighbors showed up at my door with shovels and bags of grass seed. "We figured you could use some help," one of them said. Behind them, a small group of volunteers from the block were pulling wheelbarrows and clearing debris from the wreckage. Someone even brought donuts. I couldn't believe it. The same people who had once avoided eye contact in driveways were now pitching in to repair the yard Karen had tried to turn into her personal wedding fantasy. One guy held up a ruined folding chair like it was a trophy and declared, "We should bronze this." We spent the whole weekend restoring the lawn. Someone brought music. Someone else grilled burgers. It turned into the first real neighborhood gathering I'd actually enjoyed. It was like the ghost of Karen's wedding had been exorcised with laughter, hard work, and several buckets of fresh topsoil. And just when I thought it couldn't get any more poetic, someone handed me a small box tied with twine. Inside was a mud mask, a pair of flip-flops, and a card that read, To Max, thanks for the most unforgettable mud bath in HOA history. We owe you one. A few weeks passed, and the neighborhood finally settled into a peaceful rhythm, the kind I had envisioned when I first moved to Maplewood Hills. The grass in my backyard, miraculously, began to grow back with the help of fresh seed, donated mulch, and a handful of eager neighbors who were clearly enjoying the downfall of the HOA monarchy more than they let on. Every day, someone would wave or stop by with some small offering, a potted plant, a six-pack, even a homemade pie, all with the same message behind their eyes: thank you for standing up to her. Karen, meanwhile, was conspicuously absent. Her house, once the epicenter of HOA control, looked like a museum of faded authority. The porch lights were off. The hedges, always trimmed to within an inch of their life, had grown slightly uneven. It was like even the landscaping had given up. People began to talk openly about how things would change now that Karen was out. The new HOA board was forming, and names were being tossed around. Someone even suggested I should run. I nearly choked on my coffee when that idea reached me. The last thing I wanted was to be in charge of neighborhood politics. But the idea kept floating, and eventually a small group showed up at my door holding a clipboard, ironically enough, asking if I'd at least consider serving as a temporary liaison until things stabilized. Their pitch was hard to argue with. We trust you now. You've proven you can handle insane situations with grace and sarcasm. I told them I'd think about it. The truth was, I didn't hate the idea of helping prevent another Karen incident. What I hated was paperwork. But the memory of my yard being turned into a wedding swamp kept that idea from being dismissed completely. Then, one unusually quiet Saturday morning, Karen returned. She didn't make a scene. There was no dramatic entrance, no screeching tires, no boxes slammed down in rage. Just a lone figure in a light gray hoodie, walking up the sidewalk with something in her hands. I watched from the window for a moment, unsure if it was really her. She looked different, smaller somehow, not physically but in presence. The woman who once walked with the authority of a self-appointed queen now looked like someone cautiously stepping back into a world she no longer ruled. She stood on my porch for a full minute before knocking. 3 short taps, barely louder than a whisper. I opened the door and didn't say anything. Neither did she. For a long second we just stared at each other, the silence filled with every memory of the disaster she had orchestrated. Then, without a word, she held out a plain cardboard box. I took it, curious, and opened it right there. Inside was a small potted lavender plant, a bag of organic fertilizer, and a note written in surprisingly neat handwriting that simply read, "I owe you more than this. But it's a start." I looked up, still not speaking. She finally broke the silence. "I'm not here to justify anything," she said. "I messed up. Badly. I thought I was helping. I thought I was leading. But I wasn't listening. And I definitely wasn't asking. I'm sorry." It was so unlike her that I half wondered if this was some kind of trick. But there was no condescension in her voice, no faux politeness. Just exhaustion. And something that looked a lot like shame. I nodded slowly. "You really believed you could just take over someone's yard without asking?" She exhaled and sat on the edge of the porch. "I did. I was so wrapped up in making it perfect for my daughter, in proving I could pull it off, that I forgot everything else, including basic decency." She looked out at the lawn, now green and soft again. "She still won't talk to me," she added. "Her fiancé won't even return my calls. I ruined more than one wedding that day." Part of me wanted to let her squirm, to let the weight of what she did hang in the air a little longer. But another part of me, the one that had seen her mascara run down her cheeks in the rain while a soggy wedding cake collapsed behind her, felt something resembling pity. Maybe it was the closure I didn't realize I needed. Or maybe it was just the sight of her, alone and finally listening. "You made a mess," I said. "A big one. You crossed about 10 different boundaries, trampled all over people's goodwill, and turned my backyard into a slip and slide for strangers. But you did give me a great story to tell. She actually laughed at that. Just once. Quiet and almost embarrassed. We sat in silence a little longer before she stood up. If you need help fixing anything else, she said, I have a cousin who runs a landscaping business. He's good. Not HOA certified, though. I smiled. I think I'm good. But thanks. As she walked away, slower this time, I realized something odd. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't trust her yet, but the raw, messy reality of what happened had left her less of a villain and more of a human being who had finally been humbled. A few days later, the new HOA board held its first community meeting. It was outdoors, in the small park down the street, and for once, people actually showed up voluntarily. There were no clipboards, no raised voices, just neighbors talking, laughing, making plans that didn't involve veiled threats or surprise tent deliveries. When someone nominated me to be on the board, I laughed and said no, firmly. But I offered to help draft new rules to prevent another Karen takeover. One neighbor suggested naming the clause after the incident. Another joked about calling it the No Mud Weddings Act. Everyone laughed, and it stuck. Later that week, a group of kids asked if they could use my backyard for a school science project. I asked them what kind of project. They said mud volcanoes. I nearly had a flashback, but we compromised with baking soda experiments near the pond. I figured I owed the universe one more laugh. And as for the final twist, the kind that makes you pause mid-sentence, it came in the form of a flyer dropped in my mailbox. It was an invitation. Karen was throwing a community barbecue. No RSVP required. Free food, live music, and a dunk tank. The fine print? All proceeds go toward lawn restoration and local wildlife preservation. Come dunk me, most of you probably want to anyway. I stood there reading the flyer and just shook my head, grinning. Maybe she was finally getting it. Maybe this was her way of making things right. Or maybe she just missed the spotlight. Either way, I planned to attend. And yes, I was absolutely getting in line for that dunk tank. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't sabotage. It's watching someone rebuild, one humble step at a time. Preferably soaking wet and falling backward into a cold tank of water.